Hello class, and welcome to your first online video lecture in theater history. This week we will be taking a look at Chapter 1, Theater, Its Origins and History. So before we dive into the content of the chapter, this is the time where I like to sort of pose a question and have a nice class discussion. But since we're online and you're seeing me through your computer, a little bit more difficult to have a sort of an open back and forth discussion. So instead, what I'd like to do is just take a quick moment to pose a few ideas, a few thoughts, a few questions for you to be thinking about, not just through this chapter, but throughout the semester. Because really, what we're going to be talking about is why theater? Why is it important? Why do we still do it? Why did they do it back then? So some things to think about. Why study theater history? Why? Why? That's such a good question. If you talk to any of your professors or friends or colleagues that have been through a theater training school of some sort, they all would have taken theater history, and I can guarantee you almost across the board, theater history probably would have been their least favorite class. Why? Well, when we're 17 to 21 and we're in college, we have the whole world ahead of us. It's tough to want to look back and care about what happened behind us. We're only care about where we're going, right? Now that I'm a little older, I have kids, all that, I have much stronger appreciation for what happened in the past and have the knowledge to know what I learned in my theater history class. Some of that stuff I have carried on and used in some of the productions that I've either directed or acted in or been a part of. So here are some questions, some things to think about. Why study theater history? 1. It teaches students old techniques that they can use. Not only for actors, if you learn about maybe a type of style of acting, but also for designers, so that they can, if you're doing a Shakespeare play and you want to set it as close to the way it would have looked for Shakespeare, it's important for you to know what costumes look like, what people were wearing, what the kind of audience that coming to the play, what they were wearing, what they would have been eating. All of these things are important for you to build the world of the play that you are trying to create or produce. Along with that, it gives students an understanding of past methods, techniques, and styles. Again, if you are an actor, very important to have an understanding that Greek acting, really all the way up through the 18th century in Britain, you had this very presentational style, and people would act like this, and it was, if you were evil, you'd twist your mustache and be evil, those kinds of things. We don't see that kind of acting now. We have more of this representational or truthful style of acting, trying to recreate behavior. So it's important to be able to know what kind of acting styles would they have used in the past. It provides some insight into societies of the past. So important, so important. You have heard, I'm sure all of you have heard, theater is a reflection of society. It holds the mirror up to us and it says, this is who you are. It is so important for us to go back and take a look at societies. If you are doing a play by Molière, that you understand what it was like to live in France in the 18th century. And if you go back and take a look at Shakespeare, if you go back and take a look at the Greeks, that you understand what Greek society was like, what sort of rights women had or didn't have, what sort of rights slaves had or didn't have, what it was like to be a middle-class Greek or a middle-class Roman. That will give you insight into not only their culture, but what was right, what was taboo, what was wrong. Lastly, employers will expect you to know this stuff. I can't tell you how many times I have gone in and sat down in a rehearsal or a first table read, and myself or someone else has raised their hand and asked some question that was clearly, known if you had studied some theater history. I mean, if you're doing a production of Medea and you sit down for a table read and you're in the chorus, and they start reading your chorus and you raise your hand, you go, "Was my understanding that I was in the chorus, I'd be doing some singing in here?" You were taking a modern context, of course, not what the chorus during Greek times in the theater used to be, and your director's going to facepalm. So make sure that you know this stuff so that you're able to talk on an intellectual level with other actors, other directors, and so that you know these kind of things. For the actors, acting is all about putting yourself in the shoes of the character. And so often the plays that we are in deal with non-contemporary issues or deal with time periods before now. You can't play a character truthfully unless you have an understanding of what it was like to live during that time and within that culture. And really, whether you're an actor, whether you're a director, whether you're a set designer or a costumer, having an understanding of what came before is so important for you to be successful in the productions that you're doing now. So here's the million-dollar question. What is theater? Again, I'd want to pose this to a class if we were doing this live, but this is certainly something I want you to think about, and I ask this of my acting classes and all my classes. Why are we here? What is this art form called theater? If I say, what is painting, you can certainly say, well, it's a canvas, and you have inks and paints, and you paint some sort of picture that evokes an emotional response. But when we talk about theater, are we talking about the play itself? Are we talking about the space? Are we talking about all the audience being there? Are we talking about just acting? If I get up and do a monologue alone in my room, am I doing theater? So what is theater? Well, the word itself we take from the Greek. You have the word theatron, Theatron, tron being the word meaning an instrument for, and thea, Thea, meaning a viewing. So an instrument for viewing. That's the way the Greeks very simply defined theater. But this really refers only to the audience and not all the other parts of the performance. Some people say that theater takes place everywhere, all the time. Certainly, you guys wear different hats. When you're in your classroom, you're acting like a prim and proper student, and when you go home and take your shirt off and relax, you're acting, like a teenager or someone in their young 20s. So, you're always sort of changing your play as you go through the day. So why is theater different than from, let's say, a lecture like this, or a tennis match, or some kind of protest? Oscar Brockett, who wrote another theater history textbook that we're not using in this class, defines theater as an institution. What he means by that is essentially theater is what the society or the culture that it's in calls theater, right? So here in the United States, I don't know if we call a busker someone, those people that are standing in New York City, they're all painted silver and they're standing very still. Is that theater? I don't know if we'd call it theater in this country. They might call that theater in another country there. So it's really what society deems is theater. Certainly, I think in the United States, we think of theater as being a place that you go to see a play with live actors. And if you say, what's theater, I think that's what most people would define. But it's tough to give it a firm decision. So let's take a look at some of the things that we know constitutes what theater is. So let's talk for just a minute about what some of the elements of theater are. I have three very important elements that I want to talk about in here. The first is language, whether it's verbal or nonverbal, nonverbal being things like sign language or facial expressions, those kind of things. Language-based communication is essential in order to be able to do theater. Just a bit of an interesting, I'll come back to that. Impersonation. When I ask people, what is acting, we have so many different answers, but ultimately you're a person or persons that are pretending to be people or things other than themselves. And when you get up and you do it in front of an audience, that's why we don't necessarily call a stand-up comedian theater, that I'm going to a theatrical performance. It could be on a stage, it could be in the theater, but it's a guy up there kind of being himself, telling jokes. That's different than when we get up and we essentially do a play and we stand in front of an audience and we act like someone we're not. Even if I were to play a 41-year-old online theater history instructor, it would still be someone other than me. I would still be playing a character. So language, impersonation, and lastly, audience. Big thing to think about here. Can theater exist without the audience? Would we do theater without audiences, right? If we knew there was never going to be an audience to come in and see stuff, would we all get around and rehearse a play and I'm not just talking about doing something in class, I'm talking about getting sets, getting costumes. Would we do it just for ourselves? Would we memorize all these words, do it by ourselves in a black box, all give each other a hand and walk out? I don't know. My instinct is to say no, we probably wouldn't. And so I do think that the audience is very integral part, that there's this feedback, this sending and receiving between the audience and the actors or the cast. One last interesting thought that I was going to mention earlier. There is really a theater for every disability, be it there is theater for the deaf, there is theater for physically handicapped, for the mentally handicapped. But, interestingly, there is not really a movement of theater for the blind in terms of blind audiences coming to see theater. I'm not trying to be disrespectful there. Spectators may be a better word than audience, because really it's people have to see this. There's readers' theater, certainly the blind can listen, but you don't have as much of a movement in blind theater, because the spectacle, the visual elements are oftentimes so important and for the whole sort of the bigger picture of a play. So where did theater come from? Where does it begin? Well, very soon here in just a week or so, we'll begin talking about the Greeks. And that's really where sort of theater, what we would understand today as being theater, something that we would recognize as being a theatrical experience. But we know that telling stories is such a part of the human experience, and that we've been telling stories since the very beginning. So where did theater come from? Well, I have this example that I love to use from Robert Edmond Jones, who was an American designer known for creating simplistic, impressionistic sets, very well known. And he wrote a book called The Dramatic Imagination that talks a lot about his ideas, his thoughts on theater. And you can pick this up. It's a great book to read and have in your library. So close your eyes, if you want, for a minute, and I want you to imagine yourself way back in the Stone Age, all right? It is night. We are all sitting around the fire together. We've got our whole tribe, right? Ook and Pow and Pung and Gloop and Little Ook and all the rest of us, right? We sit close together. Why? Because it's safe. We are happy and we are not afraid. On the other side of the fire are the leaders, the big men. They are the strongest, the fastest, the best hunters. And today, they have killed a lion. And it's a big deal because we know that we are going to eat, right? We can smell the meat cooking on the spit. We can look over and we can see the lion skin lying nearby. We're excited. We talk and we are afraid of silence, right? Which is exactly why audiences can't just sit and be quiet and wait. They've always got to chatter. There's always got to be something going on because we're afraid of silence. Suddenly, the leader of our tribe jumps up and he says, "I killed the lion. I did it. I followed him. He sprang at me and I struck him and he fell." He's telling us, we listen, but at once, this idea comes into his puny little caveman brain. It was like this. Let me show you. And in that instant, drama is born. The leader says, "Sit around me. Sit around in a circle so I can reach out and I can touch you." And we have our first audience. We have our first stage and our first theater. And then he says, "You, Ook, you be the lion. You put on the lion skin and I'll kill you and I'll show them how it was." And so Ook walks over and he puts on the lion's skin. And he drops to his knees and he growls. Roar! He is terrible and he is fierce. Of course, Ook isn't the real lion. We know it's just Ook. But somehow, in some mysterious way, Ook is the lion. He is now different than the rest of us. And now they begin to show us the hunt. Not tell us, show us. The leader lies in ambush. The lion growls. Roar! The hunter poises his spear. The lion leaps. Roar! We all join in with howls of excitement. Ah! The spear is thrown. The lion falls dead. Roar! The drama is finished. Ook takes off the skin, lays it down, and he sits beside us. Now Ook will forever be known as the man who can become the lion. He will always be different from the rest of us, a little apart. I'm sure many of you who are actors feel that way. We're just a little bit different. We're a little bit off because we can become these other people. And so many people who aren't involved in theater are afraid to step out of anything that's not comfortable and that they know. Ook is always different. Thousands of years had passed since the first moment of inspiration, but many things have not changed. We still like to get together in groups. We dread being alone. We like to make believe. We get lost in wonder. We can become children once more in the theater. It's as simple as that. We become children again. We can believe. Now, whether theater began in this manner or not, no one has any idea. But you can certainly imagine a scenario like this. You can see how important it is to use story to craft meaning for our lives, especially in a time before written language and probably even throughout advanced spoken language. We need to tell stories. That's how we're able to put things into context for ourselves, for our lives, for our friends, for our family. That's why we study theater history, right? We study the history of storytelling throughout the centuries so that we can know how different stories were told, how they impacted their society, and how their society, in turn, impacted the theater. So let's dive right into some content, shall we? So, Chapter 1, Theater in Everyday Life. It is important as we embark on studying the theater of the past to be aware of the theater of today and how it is all around us daily in our lives. We use imitation, especially children. I've got currently a 1-year-old or a 4-year-old. My 4-year-old, when she was a little bit younger, used to love copying what I did in the kitchen, in her own little play kitchen. So if I were mixing up some eggs, she would walk over and get a bowl and a whisk, and she'd mix up some eggs. Doing things like the wheels on the bus. That's how I've taught my daughter, some movement, some songs, singing, all right, interactive, the wheels on the bus go round, and she imitates me and she follows me. Adults do the same thing. We think that we forget this when we become adults, but you copy what others do in a job. Certainly if you've had some kind of job where you've had to learn a whole new skill, you followed someone around and you watch what they did. And as actors and directors and technicians, we look at what other technicians do. We look at how other people behave in the theater, and we try to copy or emulate those things that we think work well. We copy the mannerisms of someone that we respect, maybe. So I certainly know that one of my greatest acting teachers and a person that I care about dearly, David Hammond, that I've picked up a lot of his mannerisms, a lot of the stories that he talks about, a lot of the sort of hand mannerisms, because I really watched the way that he taught. Same thing for a medical surgeon who might, you might have someone watch how someone perform surgery, how they use their hands and try to emulate that, or a mechanic, or any number of things. So even as adults, we use imitation all the time. We role play. A little bit different than imitation, right? Role playing is sort of having these little plays that are in our everyday lives, right? We assume roles. I have assumed the role of a father, right? Of a parent. Just because I have 2 kids doesn't make me a father, right? It might technically make me a father, but certainly I have to be there, all right? And I have to emulate my own parents or other parents that I see that I think are doing a good role. And so I role play, and I role play, with my daughter as a parent. Yeah, I watch those things and I figure out how to raise her through sort of role playing, through giving her scenarios to grow as well. You role play as a brother, you role play as a student, you role play as a barista at Starbucks. When you're having a terrible day and you've got to put a smile on your face and make someone a latte that is just being a pain, you've got to role play, right? I've got to put myself in a good place and make this customer happy. You're role playing right now in this class in some form or another, although it's online, but if we were live, certainly our interaction back and forth would be a type of role playing. We are storytellers. Now, all of you are theater majors, but if in the future I don't have theater majors in this class, people love to say, oh, I'm not a good storyteller. Sure, everything you say, every story you have is a story of our day, right? Is a story of our past, and we always tell things in a story form, right? And that's why people want to listen to us, because they're interested in the conflict or the climax or what's going to happen next in our story. We tell a story all day long. Facebook and Twitter is our story of now, right? And, even on Facebook, they love to go back and show you what was happening a year ago, 5 years ago. It's telling your story for however long you've been on there. We create narrative for our lives, right? All the time. I'm telling, oh, you won't believe what happened to me. I was driving down here, and I saw this, and this happened, and that happened, and boom, and then I saw an accident. Oh, my God, right? You're telling a story. You might not feel like you're telling a story. You're just remembering some events, but someone else is hanging on every word because you're narrating it, right? Politics is a form of storytelling, all right? Which narrative do you buy? Do you buy, a conservative narrative, a more liberal narrative? Do you buy none of those narratives at all, right? They are creating a story to tell you, and depending on your worldview, you're going to buy into one of those political stories there. And religion tells stories, obviously, to teach us morals, to teach us history, and etc. So those 3 things, really, I want you to be thinking about in terms of theater in our everyday lives. We use imitation, we use role play, and we are storytellers. Continuing on with theater in everyday life, popular entertainment, right? That's really one of the reasons Broadway is so popular, why they do so many musicals, why straight plays don't run for 10 or 12 years, right? We want to be taken away. We want to escape. If you go and see Death of a Salesman, it's an incredible play. It's one of my favorite plays. But boy, it's a bit of a downer, right? And it's only going to last so long because people only want to immerse themselves in that for so long. As opposed to going and see Mamma Mia. Dancing, fun, songs that you recognize, yay! We're all into it, right? Popular entertainment. And those kind of shows run forever. Your text defines popular entertainment as group activities with a strong theatrical component. Well, you can think about rock concerts, you can think about Miley Cyrus swinging on a wrecking ball across the stage, or the big theatrical components that are put into any sort of major rock show now, whether it's the Rolling Stones or U2 or Taylor Swift. But you've got big sporting events. Think of the Super Bowl halftime show. All of that is part of popular entertainment there. So music, sports, all these sorts of things. Even the type of theater and presentations that they do in museums, at amusement parks, right? Going over to Dollywood and seeing that kind of theater over there, right? So that's a type. And then there are other forms that have lasted for thousands of years. Now, if we think back to medieval times, which we'll talk about later in the semester, they didn't really have defined theater, right? They didn't have this place where groups of people went. Instead, you'd have troubadours and minstrels and people coming through, traveling theatrical groups that would come through and put on plays, and the whole town would come out and be a community together and witness this play or this story, and that would be all under this context of popular entertainment. So whether back then or whether today, popular entertainment is such an important part of theater in our everyday lives. Ceremony and ritual. So important to theater history and our understanding of theater and why it's important and why we still do it. A ceremony is defined in the textbook as a formal, religious, or social occasion, right? So examples that we all know of a ceremony, a marriage ceremony is one of the first things that comes to mind. A graduation, all wearing your cap and gowns, playing the Olympics is a type of big ceremony bringing people together every 4 years. A confirmation. So you may be able to think of some other things that are ceremonial, right? But it is something that is definitely more formalized. A ritual is slightly different. A ritual is defined as the acting out of an established prescribed procedure. Now, ritual and ceremony can be very similar, very much the same, but they're also different in the sense that a ritual can be a lot less formal, right? A ritual can be something that is just within a family. In a ceremony, most people dress up for the occasion, right? So in a marriage, you have the bride, the groom, typically wearing a tuxedo and a wedding dress. For graduation, your cap and gown. For the Olympics, athletes wear those types of things. You don't really dress up specifically in the same thing every time when you go over to your grandparents' house for Thanksgiving. You might have to wear a tie or a nice dress, but you don't have to wear the same tie or the same dress every single year, right? Mass. Now, it's certainly a ceremony for the priest, who's someone who's standing up there and wearing their vestments and robes, right? But there's a lot of ritual in Mass, too, that's a lot less formal. And these things are repeated over and over again, and certainly the congregants in a Mass, might be dressed nice, but they don't all have to wear the same sort of uniform. The singing of the national anthem. That's one of these rituals that we do before every single sporting event. We stand up and we sing the national anthem. Why do we do that? Well, I think there's something about it brings us all together. Before we're going to get split apart by rooting for our teams and, yell boo, boo, boo and rah, 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 we're first going to come together and say, first and foremost, we're all Americans, or whatever country you might be watching this sporting event in. So what's the difference between ceremony and ritual? I talked a little bit about that. Ceremony is much more formal. Ritual doesn't necessarily have to be formal. But what is theatrical about both? Well, not always theatrical. You don't always have to think about it being big and larger than life. I mean, I've had Christmas alone before. I still had a bit of a ritual. I set up a little Charlie Brown tree and I put a couple presents that were sent by my parents underneath the tree. And I woke up in the morning and I made myself breakfast and I opened the presents and I listened to Christmas music. I fulfilled some of those traditions or some of those rituals of the tree, but there was nothing really theatrical about that, right? Marriage, on the other hand, people can go and they can just get married in front of the justice or the peace, or they can have this big, beautiful, theatrical wedding, right? And so those are some elements just to be thinking about as well. Both can have costumes, both can have sets. They don't necessarily need to. Both have scripts for the most part. Both ritual and ceremony, a lot of times, certainly in ceremony, and if you think in a religious ceremony, it is the same words. In the wedding, it is for the most part the same words that they say, do you take so-and-so, do you take so-and-so, exchange the rings, and all words and theirs, and those kind of things like that. And in a ritual, you can think about the same sort of thing happens over and over again. So think about a basketball player standing at the free throw line about to shoot. They always bounce it 7 times. That's their ritual. If they bounce it 6, it's not going to feel right. Their muscle memory is going to go. That's a kind of script, right? That's the kind of words that we are able to use over and over again in both ceremony and ritual. So along with ceremony and ritual, I always like to tell this story again, another imagined story of what it might have been like to sort of these seeds of drama. If you think back to ancient Egypt, every single year the Nile floods. And then when you think of Egypt, oftentimes you think of the pyramids and you think of desert. But right along the Nile, and for a few miles out from the Nile, it's very green and lush all the way up and down the Nile. And that's because every single year the Nile floods its banks, that water seeps into the ground and provides fertile ground. But every 100 years, like clockwork, the Nile doesn't flood. It goes into a drought. Now we know and we understand science and something to do with the direction of the sun and a cycle that we go through every 100 years. But what did they think, 3,000 years ago? They certainly weren't thinking science. They were thinking, I did something to make my God mad, to make Ra, the sun god, mad, right? And what happens when the Nile doesn't flood? People starve, right? Parents can't feed their families. You have crime and violence, okay? Those sort of things. And so what happens? Well, a farmer whose wife can't feed their children might say, I've got to do something. And so he goes down to the riverbank and he prays to Ra and he says, please bring rain, please bring rain, please bring rain. And what happens the next year? It rains. Now, he doesn't know that's just part of the cycle. He goes, it worked this time, I got to go back and do it again. And so he goes back down, he tells a few of his friends, and a few of his friends go, well, I want my crops to be good, let's all go. And so they all go down, they go, please bring rain, please bring rain, please bring rain. And over time, with ritual, they begin to use the same words over and time again, and maybe they add a little bit of a dance, please bring rain, and it keeps raining year after year. And the wives are like, we got to keep this going. We got to make sure Ra knows what you want, and so I'm going to make you a raindrop costume. So now all of a sudden you've got these guys down along the banks of the Nile in raindrop costumes going, please let it rain, please let it rain. And you've got the kids coming in, the kids want to watch, and they're sitting and they're laughing and they're goofing off. And then the wives come down and they want to cook and they have food. And now all of a sudden, after 10 years of doing this, we have the rain ceremony. And everyone comes down, and this lasts for 100 years until everyone forgot that it droughted, and then it droughts again, and then we start this ritual all over again. But you can see how important ceremony and ritual becomes over time. And that's really what theater is. We tell these stories and we continue to tell them over time so that we keep being reminded of either the terrible things or the wonderful things that human beings are capable of. Also out of Egypt, we have really, this is your first sort of theater history moment, we have what we consider to be sort of the first established drama, a known theatrical event in Egypt called the Abydos Passion Play. This play had a resurrection theme, all right, and it was part of a larger religious festival. It included a mock water battle on the Nile, so they'd have all these ships, and they'd all fire sort of blanks at each other and have this fight. And then they'd have this big funeral procession where the audience participated in. And oftentimes, we know this for a fact, many actors were injured or died in these mock battles. So what's the story? Well, very quickly, Seth is the god of evil, and he's jealous of his brother Osiris. Seth tricks Osiris into getting into a coffin and nails it shut and then throws the coffin into the Nile. Isis, Osiris's wife, finds the coffin and buries Osiris. Seth digs it up, dismembers the body, and throws it over the earth. Isis collects the pieces and buries them again. Osiris is resurrected and becomes the king of the dead, ruling all over the mortal people who ascended to heaven. Wow. So, what's the purpose of this? Well, really, it's a brutal, sort of violent kind of play and ritual. But really, the purpose of it, certainly for this time, is to keep vivid in the minds of the faithful the sufferings and the triumphs of their God. Certainly, many of you can look at your own religious upbringing and knowledge and see how that similarly translates to the passion plays of the medieval times and doing the 12 stages of the cross in Christian churches. That's all sort of to continue to remind you of the sacrifices made by the God or the Lord that you believe in, or that these other folks believed in there. So along with that, and finishing up on theater in everyday life, here's a term that I want you to know: efficaciousness, all right? Efficaciousness is something that is intended to achieve a result, right? So, again, if we look back at the Abydos Passion Play, it's to remind you to continue to be faithful. But think about people rallying together before a game, whether it's in your gym and getting the whole crowd together, or a group of football players getting together in a huddle and singing their rah-rah song, right? It's in order to bring us together to achieve a result, which is a win. Putting on makeup, right? That's intended to achieve a result, whether to attract a mate or to look good on the stage or on film. Efficaciousness, sorry, is this idea of something that is done that it's intended to achieve a result of some sort, right? And so we see that a lot in theater before. It's intended to sort of rile the audience up, but we even see it in the theater of today. If you think of some of the group theater, like Waiting for Lefty, the play about the taxi drivers in the 1930s, that was intended to get people riled up and to go and demand a change in politics, right? Lastly, what's the essential difference between theater and religion? We talked about a lot of stuff that maybe people go, sounds like a lot of the same stuff that I do in my church. Well, mainly purpose and focus, right? Religion focuses on worship, and the intent is to pray, to ask for forgiveness, to seek help, to offer praise. Theater does not involve worship, right? We may worship some actors that we love, but itself does not. There is no worshiping when we go to the theater. The purpose, again, is to hold up the mirror. It's to challenge us. It's to celebrate human beings, right? So again, I want to leave theater and everyday life on this thing. Theater is a reflection of society. If there's one thing that you take through your lives, that you take through this class, that you take through the world as a member of the theater community, theater is a reflection of society. It's continuously holding the mirror up and showing to us and go, this is who you are. Celebrate it or learn from it, or both. And finishing up with this idea of theater in our everyday lives, and talking specifically about ritual and non-ritual, and even more specifically about sort of the non-theatrical elements of ritual and ceremony. A few things that I just want you to be aware of. This idea of what's called methixis, which is essentially a group sharing, all right? So in the theater, there is oftentimes, and certainly in the West, a clear separation between the performers and the audience, right? We know who the audience is, we know who the performers are when we're in the audience. We know where we're supposed to sit, where we're supposed to look, where we're supposed to watch. It is a space that is set aside. And in the West, in this part, in Europe and the Americas, there's a clear separation between the audience and the performers. Our theater is based on what's called mimesis, all right? That's just imitation, where we are trying to imitate people and to tell stories that, again, reflect society, but we are telling the stories of other people. That's not the way it is all over the world. There is a rich theatrical tradition in Africa. However, in those tribal communities in Africa, audiences are encouraged to participate. All right, they are meant to affect the performers rather than effect the performers. Let me rephrase that. They are meant to be affected. They are meant to be changed, both the audience and the performers, by the time that the ritual or the ceremony is over. So certainly I can imagine many of you have thought about or seen on Smithsonian or National Geographic Channel ritualistic ceremonies in Africa, where you have audience members come out, they get sort of overwhelmed by the spirit, it brings them in, and they dance, and they become all a part of this sort of ceremony there, okay? So this idea of methixis, group sharing, can happen in many different ways, but it's about us getting together and sharing an experience as a group. Participatory theater, all right? Classroom exercises, psychodrama. I know that in some classes we have asked our actors to go into the psychology department and act as certain types of people that have some kind of mental disorder, and so they can be diagnosed. Those kind of things. You've heard stories of actors and directors going into prisons and getting the prisoners to do a play in order to sort of learn and grow through participatory type of theater. And then sort of in a more traditional kind of form, if you think of like the Blue Man Group, those kind of things where, we go in and they hit the drums and people get sprayed with blue paints and all those kind of things. It's involving you, even in a way like SeaWorld, sitting down there at the front and a big whale splashing everyone is in a form of participatory theater there. And then lastly, we have the prohibition of theater, which we won't really talk about. Certainly we talked about it a little bit earlier with religion and theater, but when there wasn't theater, we won't be studying that in theater history class. But certainly prohibition of theater has been something that's happened throughout time. So just to finish up here, this idea of theater in our everyday lives, this should give you some sort of sense of how theater is around us at all times. Whether we consider something a play or a theatrical event, certainly there is theater around us every day, and we see it every day. So as you're walking across campus or you're walking to your job, you may see people, you may see a couple involved in a heated argument, right? And you might stand and sort of want to stare and find out what's happening there. That's a bit of theater sort of in your everyday life. And the larger groups that we share this with is when we start talking about the kind of theater and storytelling that we're going to be talking about in this class.